and 1 mile from its aiming point. You do the math. Coming from the moon and coming within a mile of where they're supposed to. With these historic words, Armstrong will forever be connected and identified with USS Hornet. We lost this great American last month. 82 years of age, he will not be forgotten. He will always be connected to Hornet history. I think this week at the National Cathedral they had his memorial. You may have caught that on TV. Another noteworthy event during the Hornet, involving the Hornet name, occurred with the CV-8. We have 2 guys here from the CV-8, both named Paul. I've talked to both of them. What a thrill that is. The Doolittle Tokyo Raiders flew from the CV-8 Hornet in April 1942. Recent issues of the Hornet Buzz made mention of this date, the 70th anniversary of the raid on Tokyo. This year's reunion was located at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio. I was fortunate enough to attend this event this past April. The 3-day reunion featured the 5 remaining veterans out of 80 of that raid. Also, the B-25 airplanes that were used to bomb Tokyo were featured. Of the 25 flyable B-25s, 20 of them were there in April. I arrived at the base on April the 17th, the day before the historic anniversary, at 7 a.m. in the morning. The B-25s were landing, and the pattern coming around and landing. To add to the drama, circling overhead was a single Japanese Zero. If I could have found a recruiting station, I would have re-upped on the spot. After the planes were parked, the crew stayed on standby to answer questions and be part of a historic flyover the next day. Later that morning, a crowd of the plane's crews were gathered at a refreshment stand. As I approached, wearing my Hornet cap and my Hornet shirt, they greeted me warmly. They began to question me about the Hornet. Was I on the old CV-8 or the CV-12? One pilot mentioned his father was on the Franklin. Another had an uncle who served on the Bunker Hill. Both of these ships were severely damaged in 1945 and removed from combat. I explained that I saw them burning and heard later that they'd made it safely back to the United States. All kinds of questions followed. I explained that I wasn't a hero, I'm a survivor. Still the questions continued. What did I do on the ship? I was an aviation ordnanceman. I loaded bombs and machine guns on dive bombers. How long was I on the ship? 2 years. How many crew members? 3,000. How many times under attack by the Japanese? 59. And so forth. Finally, of all things, they began to ask me for my autograph. This is weird. These flyers were retired Air Force officers or retired airline company pilots, very experienced, thousands of air miles flying and all that. And they're talking to me and want my autograph. I was embarrassed by their attention. I left after shaking hands with many and several pats on the back. What an interesting experience. The next day at the outdoor memorial service, Colonel Cole, one of the survivors, who was co-pilot with Doolittle on plane number 1, spoke briefly. 4 of the 5 survivors attended this function. A flyover of B-29s followed. They made 2 passes, and then a flyover of 4 planes, saluting the 4 raiders that were present. It was most impressive. Several good histories are available. Books by Ken Glass, Hal Buell, and Lee Meredith can be ordered from our ship's store. No remarks of wartime experiences on the CV-12 come as an eyewitness report, and the highlights of that experience are as follows, so be with me please. I went aboard the ship's crew in December 1943. I'm a proud plank owner, original crew. After a brief shakedown cruise in January, we left Norfolk in February '44 to go through the Panama Canal. That was an experience. It was such a tight fit that we clipped down the concrete lamppost as we went through the lock. It was like mowing grass. Arriving in San Diego, we loaded over 2,000 Marines, along with their gear, including 250 Jeeps. You should have seen this hangar there. For the trip to Pearl Harbor. An unusual trip because the Marines had several dogs as mascots. Hornet had gone to the dog. After docking in Pearl Harbor, we offloaded the Marines and took on our group 2. We left Pearl Harbor in March of '44 and traveled 2,000 miles west to Majura Atoll in the Marshall Islands. There we joined Task Force 58, and after a few days in port, we departed on our first wartime mission, conducting raids on the islands of the Caroline chain. They included Palau, Ulithi, and Yap. A number of events occurred for the first time. A Hornet pilot shot down our first Japanese plane. On March the 25th, 1944, we crossed the equator. An initiation was held later with lots of insulting things occurring. I was converted from lowly pollywog to the high honor of being a shellback. How many shellbacks do we have here? Praise God. Tell you a story. Recently, a teacher asked me to address her class of elementary, 4th grade. So I said I would. And I talked, and I was trying to get on their level, and I talked for, and finished up. And the teacher was using it as a learning experience. She said, "Class, I want you to write this man's letter, a name and address, and thank him for coming and talking to us about World War II." So 2 or 3 days later, I got about a dozen letters, and they must have gotten together with their story. They all had 2 paragraphs. The first paragraph said how much they thanked me for coming and talking to their class about World War II. The second paragraph was, "It was sure funny hearing about you running out on the flight deck in your underwear and getting squeezed in grease guns or something like that." So much for history, brother. We lost our first dive bomber pilot over Palau Island. I'm going to pause here a moment. These things happen. Last month, I got a phone call from Dallas, Texas. And the young man said, "I picked up your name on the internet and that you're connected with the Hornet. Did you know my great uncle? He died in the first raid that the Hornet made over Palau Island." I said, "No, but I can direct you to somebody that kept a book, a record of that. His name was Hal Buell. And he has written a book called Dauntless Helldivers. And he kept very good, careful records." And I gave him the information to get in touch with him. And then I thought, well, let me get my book out of Hal's. And I read and it said in our first raid, after the Hornet attack on Palau, we got back to ship, we counted noses. Lieutenant Tex Harden was missing, and we lost him on that raid. And he said he was the finest, one of the finest men in the squadron. A guy left his phone number, and I called him back and told him that. And in a tearful conversation with me, he said, my sons will rejoice to hear that he was a hero. My grandsons will. He said, you have given me some comfort to know that my great uncle made a supreme sacrifice. I thought, well, that's great. This is what it's all about. Now, another unusual thing that occurred, wait just a minute, I need to go back here to where I'm supposed to be. June 6, 1944 was D-Day in Europe. Allied troops were beginning the Normandy invasion. It was also the same day that Hornet and the task force left 58, left from Majura and headed for the Marianas. Two interesting things occurred here. First, Don Bryant was shot down during an attack on Guam. Don had been a member. He was the president when we had the reunion in Cincinnati. I met him again this spring. He was at the Do Liberator reunion, and we talked again, and he said, always the same story. The guy that flew over and dropped the life raft almost hit me on the head. There's more to the story. He was able to get into it even though he had a wound. And the current was taking him to shore. Forgive me, I'm not supposed to use that term. The Japanese were on the beach with their guns ready, and he knew he was in trouble. And suddenly, alongside his life raft, a periscope occurred. And after a couple of times missing it, and as it came by, he finally hooked onto it, and he towed him out to sea and took him aboard. It was a rescue sub that we put on each one of these missions, and they saved countless lives. So that was the end of that, and it was a great rescue situation there. There was another unusual event that occurred at that time. This was the rescue of a man named George Tweed, T-W-E-E-D. This occurred in July of '44 as we prepared to land troops to take back Guam. George Tweed was stationed on Guam when the war broke out. In just a few days, the Japanese came and invaded the island, and they only had 100 or so people there, and they surrendered. But Tweed and 5 of his buddies got an old truck and drove back in the hills to get away. During the next year, they separated because they were too large a group, for safety. And he was witnessed each one of his buddies being captured and executed. So he made it to 44, and he was a radioman. And so when our destroyers from our task force went by pretty close, he flashed this signal. They put a boat over the side. He swam out and took him aboard. That destroyer came alongside the next morning because we were the flagship. That story went all over this ship. We went right back here and watched him come aboard. They had given him a little uniform. He was a first-class radioman. They took him up to the flag plot where our Admiral Jocko Clark was. He promoted him to chief on the spot. And so he wrote a story called Robinson Crusoe of Guam during the war. And he almost had it published, but it did not get to. But now his widow has written that story. By the way, they made a movie of this. You may have remembered it. The title of No Man is an Island, and Jeffrey Hunter played in that movie. So that was interesting. The Battle of the Philippine Sea occurred in June '44, and Hornet pilots were outstanding. In one day, over 350 Japanese were destroyed, and Hornet pilots shot down over 50 of them. 2 of our pilots became